Shalom and welcome back to another session in our series called The Life of Christ in Context. Today we're glad to have Bryan Windle back with us, and he will share with us the top 10 historical proofs or verifications of the life of Christ from individuals from the first and second centuries. It'll be a very eye-opening session. Thanks for joining us. I am delighted to welcome back Bryan Windle to this series as we bring this towards a close, this series called The Life of Christ in Context. Now, today we're going to actually look at historical proofs outside the Bible that relate to Jesus, that mention Jesus specifically. So, whereas this may not be technically context, it certainly, I think, fits the narrative of the purpose of why we're doing this series and bringing out the life of Christ and the richness that we have not only in the Gospels but also outside of Scripture in other sources. So once again, we're going to sort of focus on maybe the historical, more or less, in this session. The geographical, of course, we've talked about, the archaeological, which is one of my favorite, and Bryan's as well, the chronological and the cultural, and certainly, as the early church fathers and others mentioned, the importance of Jesus related to the soteriological or the redemptive purpose. So I want to officially welcome Bryan back to this series. Bryan lives in Canada, and I'm delighted. I've learned a lot already just creating this PowerPoint or keynote presentation that we're going to look at in the top 10 historical references, if you will, that relate to Jesus outside the Bible. So welcome back, Bryan. Again, remind our listeners what you do as a ministry, and then we'll get started.
Sure. Well, thanks so much for having me back, John. It's a pleasure to be with you. Yes, I am a pastor here up here in Canada, Northern Ontario, Canada. And that's my day job. On the side, I also help out with the Associates for Biblical Research, or ABR as we shorten it. I'm a staff researcher and writer with them, and had the privilege last year to dig with them at Shiloh, and hoping to go back again this year. We'll see whether the situation there allows that. And then I also run my own website, blog at BibleArchaeologyReport.com. So that's who I am, and that's what I do.
Well, I have appreciated your top 10 archaeological lists of various kinds, yearly lists, and of course you shared with us the top 10 archaeological discoveries that connect us to Jesus. But today is a little different, and I'm really looking forward to it. Again, as I mentioned, I've learned a lot already just in creating this. So what we're going to do is allow you to take the lead and walk us through some of these items that will connect us to Jesus well after the time of Jesus.
Yes. Well, when I published my blog on the top 10 discoveries, archaeological discoveries related to Jesus, the one we chatted about earlier in your series, I faced a little bit of flack online for that. And people who said, well, none of these prove that Jesus existed. So leaving aside the idea of archaeology proving things, and proof is really a subjective thing anyways, I wanted to address the historicity of Jesus, because I think people misunderstood my previous blog. My previous blog was showing things that illuminated the life of Christ, and certainly demonstrate, I think, the Gospels are authentically set in the first century world. But in terms of proving Jesus existed or demonstrating his historicity, I think we can certainly do that, I believe, beyond a reasonable doubt. I believe Jesus firmly existed, not just because the Gospels say so. And to clarify, I think the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, the New Testament Gospels, are the most reliable sources we have for information about Jesus' life. But for this list, I decided to look at information outside of the Bible. What would we know about Jesus historically
Mm.
if we didn't use the Bible? Because a lot of times in talking to critics, people don't want to allow you to use the Bible, and I'm not sure that's a fair thing. But in this case, I thought, well, we've got so much evidence outside of the Bible, we'll do that. And so, to make my list, I had two criteria. The first is that the sources must be from the first or second century, not later. So, for example, some quote rabbinic sources like the Talmud, about 400 to 700 AD, or later documents. I don't include them on the list. It must be
Okay.
from the first or second century. I want to get as close to Jesus' life as possible. And secondly, the sources must reference Jesus, not just Christians. And so we're looking at the historicity of Jesus. So I want to focus primarily on Jesus. So those were my two criteria in choosing the sources I chose.
Well, let's get started with the early Christian writers, and there are a few that you clustered together. Let's start with Clement.
Yeah, and this is a group of writings that is often overlooked when it comes to references to Jesus outside of the Bible. It's hard to explain the explosive growth of Christianity in the first century if there wasn't someone named Jesus, especially when you see people in the first and second century Christians writing about Jesus, some of whom learned about Jesus directly from the apostles themselves, directly from these eyewitnesses. And so it's hard to explain that if there wasn't a Jesus of Nazareth. One of them was Clement. Clement was a first century leader of the church. He was at Rome, and he wrote a letter to the church at Corinth. And in it, he talks about Jesus's teachings. He talks about the death of Christ. He talks about his resurrection from the dead. So that's important information. These are historical claims that Clement is making in his writings. Ignatius of Antioch was another person. He wrote about 110 AD. He wrote a letter to the Smyrnans in which he claimed that Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate and Herod the Tetrarch. Again, historical claims that he suffered all these things, that he, quote, suffered all these things for us, and he suffered them really, not in appearance only, even as also he truly rose again. So again, we have the historical claims made that Jesus died, that he died at a specific point in time, naming the actual rulers who were there, and that he also rose again.
Polycarp.
Polycarp,
Yeah.
yeah, one of my favorite early church fathers, if you will. In his letter to the Philippians, sometime between 110 and 140, he affirmed that Jesus lived and that he died. And Polycarp, interestingly enough, was said to have been taught directly by the original apostles. And so we're right on top of the historical Jesus when we're reading from Polycarp, who learned it directly from the eyewitnesses.
I know when we go and lead trips to Turkey, Izmir or Smyrna is where we talk about this church father who, of course, was killed because of his faith and his belief in Jesus.
Yes, and we have Justin Martyr, another first century writer, one of the first apologists, actually. Sometime in the middle of the second century, 155 to 157, he argues that Jesus was a teacher, that he was crucified, that he died, and that he rose again, making historical claims about the life of Christ.
Seems like the central theme is Christ's death and resurrection from these early guys.
It is, and that's not surprising because the Apostle Paul, in 1 Corinthians 15, right? He said, I
Sure.
want to pass off what's of a first importance, that Christ died and that he rose again according to the scriptures. And so that seems to be one of the big themes that we're going to see. Papias, again, writing. This is writing within 100 years of the life of Jesus. He wrote that he learned of Jesus's teachings directly from those who had heard him in person. Again, we're right on top of the historical Jesus in reading the writings of Papias. Quadratus is an early Christian apologist, often overlooked. He wrote a letter to the Emperor Hadrian, who about 117 to 138 AD in defense of Christianity, and he stated, quote, "But the works of our Savior were always present, for they were genuine. Those that were healed and those who were raised from the dead, who were seen not only when they were healed, but when they were raised, but also, but were also present." And not merely while the Savior was on earth, but also after his death. They were alive for quite a while, so that some of them lived even to our day. And so Quadratus making the claim that you can check out this stuff because some of the people who knew Jesus are alive to this day. And so a very important quote, again, noting the historical claims about Jesus healing people and dying and rising again.
Okay, let's move on to number 9. And this gentleman lived in 140 AD. Tell us a little about this individual.
Yeah, this is, I'm not exactly sure how I would pronounce his name. I would say Phlegon of Tralles, who
That's why
wrote,
I didn't introduce the name, because I wasn't sure how to pronounce
yeah,
pronounce it
we'll call
myself.
him Phlegon of Tralles. He wrote a book of history around the middle of the 2nd century. And while it is no longer extant, we don't have an original manuscript of that. We have quotations in other writers about his work, and this isn't a problem for historians. Many works have been lost to history, but we have sections of them that have been written verbatim in other works, and that's what we have with Phlegon of Tralles. Origen cites several passages in which Phlegon refers to Jesus, and he writes, now Phlegon in the 13th or 14th book, I think, of his Chronicles, not only ascribed to Jesus a knowledge of future events, but also testified that the result corresponded to his predictions. He went on to say, to talk about an eclipse that was in the time of Tiberius Caesar, in whose reign Jesus appears to have been crucified, and great earthquakes that took place. That's in the 13th and 14th books as well. And so we again have writing very early on talking about Jesus, his life during the reign of Tiberius Caesar, even mentioning some of the things that the Gospels mention. We're talking about the eclipse and the earthquakes that accompany the death of Christ as recorded in the Gospels.
Do you recall where Tralles is geographically? I don't know myself.
Yeah, I don't know that. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just wanted to see what region he was from. But we continue with him, another citation by
Yeah,
Origen.
yeah.
Yeah.
Again, just this reference to the eclipse in the time of Caesar and the crew. Again, we're dating things, and we're actually um, we're seeing people discuss events that happened in the 1st century and trying to figure out what was happening with those particular events. And so I just find this quote really important because it affirms a number of the details that are recorded in the Gospels surrounding the death of Christ.
Yeah, this is a quote you mentioned before, and my apologies, I didn't catch up with you. But
Yeah, we have another one here from Phlegon of Tralles. See,
yep.
In the preceding pages, we've made our defense according to our ability, adducing the testimony of Phlegon, who relates that these events took place at the time when our Savior suffered. He goes on to say, and now he's going to quote Phlegon. He says, Jesus, while alive, was of no assistance to himself, but that he arose after death and exhibited the marks of his punishment and showed how his hands had been pierced by the nails. Again, referencing an event in the Gospels. And so This is within about 100 years, just a little more than 100 years after these events took place, and so this is right historically in the grand scheme of things. This is right back on top of the events. Again, a reference to Jesus outside of the Bible.
We can talk on Israel Tours about Byzantine traditions, and of course that begins not till the 4th century, 5th century, and even later. But when we have testimonies like this so close to the time that it happened, only merely a little over 100 years ago, that's, I think, quite significant. So keep this in mind as we move to number 8 and talk about Thallus.
Yes, this is a really important one. Thallus, he's probably the earliest non-Christian writer who refers to Jesus.
Hmm.
And so while we started at number 10 with Christian writers, all the writers in the rest of my list, 9, 8, and all the way down, are non-Christian writers. So if critics want to dismiss number 10 because they would say they're biased, none of the rest of these guys are biased.
That's important.
We would almost, if we want to use a legal term, we might say they're hostile witnesses to Christ. And Thallus, a non-Christian writer, and again, his work is quoted in another work by Julius Africanus around 220, which is itself quoted by a Byzantine writer. And this is discussing the darkness that accompanied the crucifixion of Jesus. And so that's the context. And Thallus, keep in mind, is writing in 55 AD. This is before the time when some of the Gospels themselves were even written. We have an important quote here. So this is what he writes.
55 AD. Wow, that's quite impressive. That close to the life of Christ.
Yeah, here's his quote. He says, on the whole, there pressed a most fearful darkness, and the rocks were rent by an earthquake, and many places in Judea and other districts were thrown down. And this is now Julius Africanus quoting. He says, now Thallus, in his third book, his history, calls, as he appears to me, without reason, an eclipse of the sun. And so here's the thing about this quote. It doesn't specifically say Jesus in the quote, but Julius Africanus, who would have had the full context of what Thallus is saying in front of him, is using this and refuting Thallus's argument. What it seems to be saying is this: look, Thallus is just passing this eclipse off as a natural event, that it had no theological significance. But Julius Africanus is arguing that it did have theological significance. And so that's an important thing to understand. Robert Van Voorst explains this. He says, Thallus could have mentioned the eclipse with no reference to Jesus, but it is more likely that Julius, who had access to the context of this quotation in Thallus, and who, to judge from other fragments, was generally careful user of his sources, was correct in reading it as a hostile reference to Jesus' death. The context in Julius shows that he is refuting Thallus's argument that the darkness has no significant, it is not religiously significant. And so, again, I would argue that Thallus is clearly referencing something at the time of Jesus. As a hostile witness, he's saying, no, it has no theological significance to this Jesus you're talking about. And Julius Africanus is countering that, saying, no, I don't think that that's reasonable, and he's going on to say it does, just as the Gospels state. So an important one. And here's another one: Celsus. Celsus, writing in around 175 AD. He was a 2nd century Greek philosopher, and he wrote a treatise attacking Christianity. It's called the True Doctrine. And his work remains, again, primarily through quotations, in Origen's rebuttal against Celsus, some 75 years later. And Origen is summarizing Celsus's arguments, and he's noting that Celsus has used this literary device of having a Jew talk with Jesus, and this is what Origen writes: in imitation of a rhetorician. Training a pupil, he, Celsus, introduces a Jew who enters into a personal discussion with Jesus and speaks in a very childish manner, altogether unworthy of the gray hairs of a philosopher. Let me endeavor, to the best of my ability, to examine his statements and to show that he does not maintain throughout the discussion the consistency due to the character of a Jew. For he represents him disputing with Jesus and confuting him as he thinks on many points. And so he goes on to say, in the first place, he accuses him of having, again, quote here, invented his birth from a virgin. And so this is Celsus's argument here, and upbraids him with being, quote, again, a Celsus quote here, born of in a certain Jewish village of a poor woman of the country who gained her subsistence by spinning, and who was turned out of doors by her husband, a carpenter by trade, because she was convicted of adultery, that after being driven away by her husband and wandering about for a time, she disgracefully gave birth to Jesus, an illegitimate child who, having hired himself out as a servant in Egypt on account of his poverty, and having there acquired some miraculous powers on which the Egyptians greatly pride themselves, returned to his own country, highly elated on the account of them, and by means of these proclaimed himself God. Now, this is a very interesting quote. There's a lot of stuff in here that is not historical, but you can see the roots of the historical Jesus, particularly as we compare it with the Gospels. And it's not surprising. There were rumors about Jesus even when he that were floating around about what he was apparently like. Some writing him off as just a drunkard and doing things, trying to explain the miracles in other ways, trying to explain his resurrection in other ways. So there were lots of things going around in the first century, but this is important because we see that he was born of a virgin. He was known to have performed miracles, that he claimed to be divine. And while Joseph didn't drive Mary away because of adultery, it certainly captures Joseph's initial thoughts that he had. And so another important quote from a hostile witness in the 2nd century.
And the details match perfectly with the gospel account, especially the birth of Jesus, Egypt, and then returning to the Galilee. Here's number 6, Lucian in 166.
Yeah, Lucian of Samos. He was a famous Greek satirist, and he refers to Jesus in his work called The Death of Peregrine, which was written sometime after 165, so in the 2nd century. And he said, the Christians, worship a man to this day, the distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on account of that. You see, these misguided creatures start with the general conviction that they are immortal for all time, which explains the contempt of death and voluntary self-devotion, which are so common among them. And then it was impressed on them by their original lawgiver that they are all brothers from the moment that they are converted and deny the gods of Greece, and they worship the crucified sage and live after his laws. And so we see Lucian affirming the following historical facts. Jesus was the founder of a religion who was crucified. His followers were converted and considered themselves spiritual brothers and sisters. We're seeing some of Jesus' teaching here, and that Jesus' followers worshiped him as God. That's important historical claims that we see, historical facts that are being written about by Lucian of Samos.
Okay,
Yeah,
Bar Serapion. How do you pronounce his
yes,
name?
I think that's pretty good. He has a very interesting story. He was a man who was taken captive when his city was destroyed by the Romans. And from prison, he wrote a letter in Syriac to his son, who was also called Serapion. And encouraging him to pursue wisdom. And in it, Marabar Serapion refers to Jesus. Now, again, this is first century. This is AD 73. And he
Mm.
says, what else can we say when the wise are forcibly dragged off by tyrants? Their wisdom is captured by insults, and their minds are oppressed and without defense. What advantage did the Athenians gain by murdering Socrates, for which they were repaid with famine and pestilence? Or the people of Samos by the burning of Pythagoras, because their country was completely covered in sand in just 1 hour? Or, and here it is, the Jews by killing their wise king.
Wow.
Because their kingdom was taken away at that very time. God justly repaid the wisdom of these three men. The Athenians died of famine, the Samians were completely overwhelmed by the sea, and the Jews, desolate and driven from their own kingdom, are scattered through every nation. Socrates is not dead because of Plato, neither is Pythagoras because of the statue of Juno, nor is the wise king because of the new laws that he laid down. Now, Jesus isn't named by name in here, but it's interesting to note that Jesus was called the King of the Jews. He was called the King of the Jews by Pilate. He was called the King of the Jews by Roman soldiers. He was called the King of the Jews by the Jews themselves. And so in the first century, Jesus was known by multiple groups as the King of the Jews. Now, whether they thought he was or not, that was the title he was known by. And so it's virtually certain that Mara Bar Sapion is referring to Jesus here, and again talking about how his teachings live on.
Two observations. Appears to be a very Aramaic name, doesn't it? Bar being
Mm-hmm.
son, and also the date 73. I think of Metzada or Masada, the end of the first revolt in Israel. The Jews, of course, were uprising and sort of were defeated once and for all at Masada. Most of you know the story, of course, there. But wow, 73, that's just a key date, I think, in history.
Yes, and
Number
so now
four.
we get into the top four, and the top four are probably the most important ones. So it's no surprise that they're on at the top of this list. They're at the top of just about everybody's list.
Mhm.
Pliny the Younger was a Roman governor of Bithynia, and he wrote a letter to the Emperor Trajan asking for advice on how to deal with Christians that he was persecuting. And so he lays out in Book 10, Letter 96, the procedure that he used to Trajan. And so this is what he says. He talks about others whose names were given to me by an informer first said that they were Christians, and afterwards they denied it, declaring that they had been, but were now no longer. And some of them, having recanted many years before, and more than one so long as 20 years back, they all worshipped your image and the statues and of the deities and cursed the name of Christ. So this is Christians who apostatized and who now are cursing the name of Christ. But he goes on and he gives some more information. He says they declared that the sum of their guilt or their error only amounted to this, that on a stated day they had been accustomed to meet before daybreak and to recite a hymn among themselves to Christ, as though he were a god, and that so far from binding themselves by oath to commit any crime, their oath was to abstain from theft, robbery, adultery, and from breach of faith, and not to deny trust money placed in their keeping when called upon to deliver it. And so we're within 100 years of these events happening, and Trajan is recording. First of all, he affirms Christ as a historical figure, and it demonstrates, interestingly enough, this quote, that the early Christians were worshiping Jesus as God. And that is a startling claim. This is not some legend that grew up hundreds and hundreds of years later, that the church concocted in the Byzantine era, as some people say. This is a very early claim about the deity of Christ, and again from a hostile witness, Pliny the Younger. It's interesting. Trajan responded to Pliny, and he said, "Look, don't go looking for Christians, don't go hunting them out, but if they admit they're Christians, then you punish them." That was his response to Pliny's request.
And you wonder what influence the Apostle Paul had in all these non-Christian people who are giving testimony. Paul's theology was uh, Christological to the core, of course, and I just see a continuation of Paul's theology in some of these quotes.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
Number
All right,
three.
Suetonius. Suetonius. Now, Suetonius is a Roman historian, and he wrote a very famous work. It's called The Lives of Caesars. You can still buy it today, and he gives a brief history of the first 12 Caesars, so from Julius Caesar to Domitian. And in his chapter on the life of Claudius, the emperor from 41 to 54, he explains the reason for the emperor's decision to expel the Jews from Rome. Now, this is an event that is recorded in the book of Acts. So the Bible records this event, and Suetonius records this event, and he gives the explanation for it. He says, since the Jews consistently made disturbances at the instigation of Christus, that's Christ. It's a Latin would be Christus, but Christus is a spelling we occasionally see for that. He expelled them from Rome, and so it's an important reference that demonstrates that within 100 years of the life of Jesus, an emperor knew that he existed, knew that this was that the claims that Christians were making were causing all kinds of disturbances with the Jews. And so to get rid of the problem, he expelled the Jews from Rome because they were causing such a disturbance about Christians trying to worship Jesus. And so an important event, again, within 100 years of the life of Jesus.
So reference to Acts 18, that means we're in the second journey of Paul.
Right. Yep.
So contemporary with Paul being at places like Corinth and, of course, the area of Athens. This is interesting. So another historical reference. And, of course, most of us have heard of this guy, Josephus,
Yes.
who is quite
Josephus.
articulate about the name and actions and ministry of Jesus.
Yes, and a prolific writer. He was a Jewish Roman historian, and he included a very famous, and I would say controversial, quote about Jesus in his work Antiquities of the Jews. And it's known as the Testimonium Flavinium by many scholars. But here's the thing, almost all scholars, whether you're Christian or not, recognize that the quote that is usually given about from Josephus has been added to, interpolated by some Christian scribe later on, putting words in the mouth of Josephus that he likely would not have said. So, for example, the quote usually says, "He was the Christ." Well, no Jew would make that claim that he is the Christ. They might say people thought he was the Christ, but they wouldn't make that particular claim. And so scholars for years tried to figure out what was the original quote like. And then in the 1970s, an Arabic version of the passage was discovered and published, and it did not contain the Christian interpolations. And so it is likely the authentic version of what Josephus wrote. I should also note that it's very close to what a lot of scholars figured Josephus might have written when they removed the Christian interpolation. So this is what the quote says. And again, this is the Arabic quote, so the accurate one. At this time, there was a wise man who was called Jesus. His conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. And many people from among the Jews and other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die. But those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets have recounted wonders. That is something that a Jew might have written in the first century. And so that is, I would say, I believe that's the accurate quote from Josephus. And again, very important because it talks about a number of historical facts. First of all, the historicity of Jesus is affirmed. He also writes about Jesus in another passage where he's describing the death of James, the brother of Jesus, who is called Christ. So Josephus absolutely affirms and proves, if you want to use that word, the historicity of Jesus. But he goes on to other things, that he was condemned by Pontius Pilate, that he was known to be good and virtuous, just some great, that he appeared 3 days after his conviction, that people were saying that he was alive, and his connection to the claim to be Messiah. All of these important historical facts that, again, line up with what we see in the Gospels.
Yeah, the mentioning of the name Pilate. Of course, we could talk about the Pilate inscription at Caesarea in 1961 and two. So another name associated with Jesus, and of course, the person who crucified Jesus in Jerusalem. Well, you got a sneak peek here. I already advanced the slide, but let's stay put and drum roll, please.
There we
Number
are.
one, please.
Tacitus, and I think this is the most important quote about Jesus. And I would put it above Josephus because there's no controversy about this.
Good idea.
Virtually every scholar agrees this is what Tacitus wrote sometime around 116 AD. He was a Roman historian who left a couple of works. One is the Annals, and in his Annals, now here's the context, Tacitus is writing about suspicions that the Emperor Nero was the one who started the Great Fire of Rome, and how Nero tried to deflect the blame onto someone else because people were starting to talk out loud about him being the one who started it. And so this is what he wrote. He said, consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, that's the Latin of Christ, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty, that's crucifixion, during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out, not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. So again, an independent witness. Almost all scholars agree this is independent. It's not like Tacitus read a gospel and then copied the information. This is an independent source. He's talking about Christ and Christians from whom they get their name, that he was crucified during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of Pontius Pilate. And what I find really interesting about this quote is that he references a most mischievous superstition that broke out in Judea and spread even to Rome. And I would suggest that that is a veiled reference to the rumors that Jesus had risen from the dead, because as you noted earlier, that was the heart of what Christians went around talking about. This guy who Pontius Pilate crucified came back to life. He is the Christ. He is God. And so a really important quote for us, again, within 100 years of the actual event happening.
Another historical name mentioned. You said it, you read it, Tiberius. Another name that appears on the inscription there at Caesarea, found in 1961. Remarkable, just the commonality of these quotes, the Christological focus, even those who did not know Christ personally, even those who maybe thought all of this was not true or applying to them, and yet we do know that as followers of Christ, we can really appreciate these sources that verify, though Christ doesn't need to be verified, the proof of his existence. Of course, the Gospels speak loudly there on our behalf. But what a wonderful list, Bryan. Tremendous list. I learned a lot, these quotes. And again, all of these quotes and sources, you tell us, Brian, where you can find them, because I basically just copied and pasted them with full credit to you. But if our audience would be more interested in detail about further detail about this, where could they go um, on the web to find out what you wrote about this?
Yeah. So if you go to my website, which is BibleArchaeologyReport.com,
Okay.
you'll find a blog called The Top 10 Historical References for Jesus Outside of the Bible. And I footnote every quote. So you could go to that work. In many cases, I've used an online, because many of these old works are the full text is online somewhere. So I've linked it oftentimes
Mm.
um right to a place that they can go, but every one of them is footnoted, and you can go, and it's fun to do that. I sometimes joke that I'm a bit of a nerd. I like to read old writings of dead people long gone, but it's really helpful to see the historical context. You talk about the series as the life of Christ in context. When you read these historical documents, you're reading about the context of the world in which Jesus lived, and in which the subsequent generations of people who were hearing about Jesus lived. So, just some important documents. I think we can conclusively say the historicity of Jesus has been absolutely verified. In fact,
Mm.
I would argue there is more evidence for Jesus than just about any other first century figure from history.
I would fully agree. And again, great list. For our audience, well, I will post that link, specific link, in the notes below this video, so you can follow that at your leisure and learn more detail about what Brian has just shared. So, Brian, thanks again for joining us in this series. A wonderful session, and I hope that everyone enjoyed it and benefited. I know I did. And you are really gifted in terms of sharing historical information and resources for us. So thank you so much. Toda rabah in Hebrew, as we say. And just we are thrilled that you have made time to be with us. So with this, we'll bring this session to a close. And I hope that you're able to join us for another session. So with that, again, take care. Thanks for joining us, and shalom.